Welcome to Talk 10A of World History, which is really look at the spread of Christianity and the development of democracy. Essentially what happens, we've come to the end of the Western Roman Empire around about 470 AD, and the collapsing Roman Empire leaves Christianity in the West in a bit of turmoil along with everything else. And there's a loss of educational facilities, a loss of reading and writing, and often why it's called the Dark Ages. And there has to be, in a sense, the re-evangelization of Western Europe. But before I look at the re-evangelization of Western Europe, it's worth noting that in the Eastern Empire, centered around Byzantium, there was in fact still a vigorous Christian presence, which we now recognize as the Eastern Orthodox Church, which did evangelism into Russia. And that's why Russia is essentially an unorthodox Christian country. And then if we go further east, we come to Persia, and the Persian church, what's often called the Nestorian Church, developed its own form of Christianity. It had to keep itself distant from the Roman Empire because the Persians were traditionally the enemies of the Roman Empire. But the Nestorian Church established missions in Central Asia, China, and in India. There's some debate as to whether the church in India was established by St. Thomas, one of the disciples, or whether it in fact was a Nestorian church. But be that as it may, we know there is a church in India that dates back to this time. Now, sadly, this church, though it flourished for many years, by about the 11th century was beginning to be in decline and was effectively destroyed by Tamerlane in the 15th century. And there are pockets of this church, but certainly not in Central Asia or in China. Another church that flourished throughout the last 2,000 years has been the church in Ethiopia. Obviously, we kind of remember the story of the Ethiopian eunuch who was evangelized by Philip. Well, it's clear that Ethiopia had a strong and long tradition of Jewish influence. The Ethiopians claim that the Queen of Sheba was actually one of their queens and had a child from Solomon, and that's where they claim the royal line comes from. That there's been a Jewish community in Ethiopia for thousands of years is known, and there was an exciting story of the Ethiopian Jews being returned to Israel only recently, and I think it's been made into a film. So the church in Ethiopia had certainly fertile ground in the Jewish community, and it flourished and is still there to this very day. Had strong ties with the Egyptian Coptic Church under Athanasius, who sent missionaries down there, and continued those ties really up until the 19th century. But unlike the Nestorian Church, the Ethiopian Church really only spread to the surrounding regions of Ethiopia. So as far as we are aware, there's been no Christian presence in Africa until European missionaries arrived. If we now come to the story of the re-evangelization of the West, we have to step back a little bit in time to a person who lived in the latter days of the Roman Empire, Patrick, who as a teenage lad was living in Romano, Britain, around about 370 AD. He was captured by pirates from Ireland, was in a sense a slave for many years, managed to escape, returned to Britain, but God had told him that he was to go back to Ireland to be a missionary. And this he did with great effect. And Ireland, under his tutelage, effectively became a Christian enclave, which was really important during the Dark Ages because Christian writing and reading was maintained when much of Europe was under destruction. And so Ireland became a center of education and academic excellence. From Ireland, missionaries then started to go back into Britain. The first was Columba, who set up a mission agency in Iona on the west coast of Scotland, a very attractive island if you ever go there. And then from that community in Scotland, Scotland was evangelized, and eventually Aidan was sent down to Northumberland, the Northern English Kingdom, and there he established a community in Holy Island, or Lindisfarne. And from there, the gospel was spread south. It's roughly the same time, it's about 587 AD, Pope Gregory the Great sent a missionary, Augustine, to Canterbury, or to Kent, and he evangelized the southeast of England. And so, in a sense, England got evangelized from both directions, from the north and from the south. And at the Synod of Whitby in about 666 AD, the nation decided to essentially follow the Roman Church rather than what had become known as the Celtic Church. The Celtic Church actually thrived in Wales at this time. It maintained its Christian heritage right through the Roman Empire, right through to this time, and one of its famous saints was Saint David. And so you get a little bit of a picture of the evangelization of Britain. And actually from Britain, people went out like Boniface to Germany to evangelize the Saxons. And so there's a clear sort of missionary approach to Christianity throughout this period, a really rugged period, and great people who established marvelous things. And there was a level of learning and culture that was going on. Sadly, a lot of this was destroyed when the Vikings came towards the end of the 8th century. They destroyed Lindisfarne, I think around about 987, not 789 AD. And as a result of their attacks over the next 70 to 80 years, Britain was largely destroyed in terms of being a Christian nation, and its institutions were undermined, and education effectively was abandoned. There was only one kingdom left of the 7 that formed England at this point. It was called the Heptarchy, and that was Wessex. And under the leadership of Alfred, who was actually called Alfred the Great, and there's good reasons why he's called that, we have the fight back, as it were, against the Vikings. Alfred was actually a godly person, a genuinely godly person from all accounts. He had Guthrum, the leader of the Viking hordes, who had constantly gone against his sworn word. He had Guthrum in his control at one point at Chippenham, where he could have wiped out the entire Viking army. But instead, he wanted to make peace. And he kind of said to Guthrum, look, you've kind of broken your rules, your sort of pledges so many times. I'm going to do this, but you must become a Christian. Now, this may not be the best way to do Christianity, but that was the way Alfred did it. And Guthrum did, and a lot of his leaders did, of the Viking horde. And they were true to their word this time. They didn't break their promises. Whenever Vikings invaded again, they did not support them. And so Alfred said, look, you return back to your half of the kingdom, and I'll stay in my half. And that's where we get the concept of Danelaw, which is basically if you take a line from London up to the Dee and Chester, and everything northeast belongs to the Vikings, everything southwest belongs to Alfred. Now, after Alfred's, well, actually, one or two other things to say about Alfred. Alfred created the navy in order to stop the Vikings from arriving. He also created planned towns, burghs that were scattered throughout the southwest to find defensible positions. He created a real culture of reading and writing, demanding that his senior officials and senior army officers learnt these things. And he really encouraged the church. So there's a lot to be said for Alfred. And he also set about the laws, codifying the laws, and make sure that they were something that was reasonable and applicable to the Bible. His successors were actually very competent, which is not always the case. And they had a succession of kings after him who maintained and built up the kingdom. And at this point, we had the shires, which we still have to this day, established. And in fact, England became such a well-run country that when it was invaded and became very attractive, I used to add to people to invade because it was so wealthy. Canute, who was a Dane, when he invaded, he didn't destroy the system he found. Far from it. He took it over, and it worked very well for him. Likewise, when Duke William of Normandy invaded in that famous date, 1066, though he dispossessed the entire ruling class of the Saxons, and probably one of the biggest land transfers in history took place at that point, he maintained the institutions and the shires and everything, because he knew very well that he had found a very wealthy kingdom, and this was something he wanted to tax. And in fact, one of the great books of the Middle Ages, the Domesday Book, produced by William in 1087, was such a document. It was really a taxation document, but it kind of codified everybody in the country and what they were worth. That was a massive undertaking, but it did show a level of organization. And this kind of feeds into the development of democracy, because the nation had developed centralized institutions. Henry I and Henry II were kings who really established laws and a legal system that was increasingly being administered from the center rather than the barons establishing their own laws. Law became the king's justice. And this centralization was really quite important because it created a sense of nationhood, a sense of of a core identity, that you could appeal to the king if you wanted to have your case tried. Well, the barons weren't always happy with the kings, as you can imagine, because not every king was a good king. And then with King John, you had a bad king. And as a result, the barons insisted that the king should be under the law, hence the Magna Carta. And this is a very important concept, that the supreme authority in a nation should actually be under the law rather than the law and above the law as a result. And that concept, which gives us the rule of law, is very important in the development of a democracy. Because otherwise, whoever is in power can just basically abrogate all the rights and privileges that you may have acquired over many centuries. The next involvement was in about 1268, when Simon de Montfort established the first parliament. And again, this was really to control a king that was felt to be out of control. Here, his adversary, who was Henry III's son, Edward, who eventually kills Simon de Montfort, or arranges for his death, I should say, during a battle, decides to maintain this concept of a parliament. And so this concept that taxes and laws should be decided by the people was something that became enshrined quite early on. And it wasn't just the nobles that formed this parliament, it was actually representatives from the towns and from the shires. And this concept of a collective community, political community, that would decide on laws and decide on taxation was a very important concept. It was actually not unique to England. Other parts of Europe knew about parliaments, but the English parliament uniquely stayed strong and got stronger as the years went by. So that under Henry VIII, his henchman, Thomas Cromwell, used parliament very effectively as a means for Henry to be able to dissolve the monasteries and change the church arrangements during the Reformation, without saying necessarily it was Henry doing it. It was his parliament doing it, thus deflecting any sort of problems that might have come from the unpopularity of these decisions. However, once investing Parliament with such levels of responsibility, it's very difficult then to take it away. And so when the Stuarts came onto the thrones of Britain in 1603 with James I and then Charles, his son, they tried to reassert the authority of the monarchy in the concept of divine right of kings, but it was too late. Parliament had established itself in the minds of many people as being a legitimate part of government, and it was not the king's right to stop calling Parliament. And so eventually, when the king needed to raise taxes to fight a little local war, the Parliament demanded it got its say, and it demanded that the king should never again have the power not to call Parliament. And in 1642, Charles I got so fed up with the Parliament's demands, he raised an army to fight Parliament. And thus was the Civil War. He ultimately lost, by 1645 and eventually was beheaded in 1649. And there was an 11-year period where Parliament, well, it was essentially supposed to be Parliament ruling, but it didn't. In the end, it became a dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell, who was the lead commander. So by 1660, having been fed up with Oliver Cromwell's somewhat dictatorial rule, we called back the king. So Charles I's son, Charles II, comes back to the throne. It's called the Restoration, but it's very much understood that Parliament is top dog now. And eventually in 1689, this whole situation comes, well, 1688, this whole situation comes to a head with Charles II's brother, James II, having annoyed everybody, particularly with his policies towards promoting Roman Catholics, which at that time was not considered something that a very Protestant nation like Britain wanted to have happen. We had another attempt to change everything. So we called in a Dutch king, William III, and he became our king in order to make sure that we had a Protestant succession to the throne rather than a Catholic one, which was the case with James II. And this is called the Glorious Revolution. And that sets the British Constitution really for the next 300 years, because it becomes essential for Parliament to rule the country, and the king is a constitutional monarch. And from that concept of democracy, what we call parliamentary democracy, it gets spread around the world. And so we now have today as a dominant ideal, not always practiced, that of parliamentary democracy. Now, in my next talk, I'm going to look a little bit more at another feature of this period, which is the Reformation, which I consider to be incredibly important. But I'll explain why, and why I think the Bible has something to say on this matter. But thank you for listening.